The air in the apartment was thick with the remnants of the night. Half-empty glasses scattered across the marble countertops, the faint smell of expensive perfume and spilled alcohol lingering in the air. Music was still playing in the background, though most of the guests had already left, stumbling out into the night in their designer clothes. Ethan stood by the balcony, nursing his drink and watching the city lights below. From this height, everything looked calm, peaceful even. But inside the apartment, the tension was palpable. He glanced over his shoulder at Mia, who was perched on the arm of the couch, laughing at something Brad had said. Brad, of course, was still here, one of the few who hadn't left. He was the kind of guy who always lingered, the one who stayed just a little too long, who got a little too close. Tall, cocky, and effortlessly charming, Brad was everything Ethan wasn't. And Mia loved the attention. Ethan couldn't help but feel the knot in his stomach tighten as he watched them together. The way Mia leaned in when Brad spoke, her fingers casually brushing against his arm as she laughed. It was subtle, but not subtle enough for Ethan to miss. They'd been like this all night, and it was starting to get under his skin. Mia had introduced Brad as a friend from the industry. They'd met at some fashion event, of course, because Mia's world was filled with glamorous people like him. Beautiful, carefree, and always just a little too flirtatious. Ethan had never fit into that world, but he loved Mia. That was enough, right? Still, tonight felt different. "You okay, babe?" Mia's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She smiled at him from across the room, her perfect red lips curving up as she tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting under the dim lighting. "You've been quiet tonight." "I'm fine," Ethan lied, offering her a tight smile. Mia's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she turned back to Brad, who was now casually draped over the back of the couch, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched Ethan from the corner of his eye. "You sure, man?" Brad chimed in, his voice dripping with that same cocky confidence that had grated on Ethan all night. "You seem a little tense." Ethan forced a laugh, though it came out more bitter than he intended. "Long day at work, I guess." "Right," Brad drawled, his eyes flicking between Ethan and Mia. "Work." He dragged out the word like it was some kind of joke, like Ethan's entire life was a joke. Mia giggled, taking a sip from her wine glass, her attention drifting back to Brad. Ethan felt his grip tighten around the tumbler in his hand, his knuckles turning white. He hated feeling like this, like he was watching something slip away from him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The night dragged on, with Mia and Brad continuing their light-hearted banter. Ethan tried to tune it out, to convince himself that he was overreacting, but every laugh, every touch was like a dagger to his chest. Eventually, Brad stood up, stretching dramatically. "I should get going," he said, though his tone didn't carry any real sense of urgency. He lingered by the couch, his gaze lingering on Mia just a little too long. Mia stood too, walking him to the door. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice sweet and playful. "We should do this again sometime." Ethan clenched his jaw as he watched them from across the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Something about the way they said goodbye, the way Brad's hand lingered on Mia's back, sent a wave of unease crashing over him. Brad turned to Ethan one last time before stepping out the door, flashing him that smug, infuriating smile. "Take care, man." And just like that, he was gone. Mia shut the door behind him, turning to Ethan with a satisfied smile. "That was fun, wasn't it?" Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at her, his mind racing with 1,000 unspoken questions. Something had shifted tonight, something he couldn't ignore. Mia's carefree attitude, the way she flirted so effortlessly with Brad, the way she dismissed Ethan's unease without a second thought. It was all too much. "You seemed close with Brad," Ethan said finally, his voice tight. Mia's smile faltered for just a second before she shrugged, walking over to him. "Oh, come on, Ethan. He's just a friend. You're not jealous, are you?" He hesitated, unsure how to respond. Was he jealous? Maybe. But it wasn't just jealousy. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. "You sure about that?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his tone light, but the edge in his voice was undeniable. Mia rolled her eyes, leaning in to press a kiss to his cheek. "You worry too much." But the pit in Ethan's stomach only grew deeper as he watched her walk away, her laughter echoing down the hallway. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't sure if he could trust her. Ethan sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The morning sunlight streamed through the large office windows, casting a warm glow across the room. But it did nothing to ease the cold, sinking feeling in his stomach. He hadn't slept much the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, images of Mia and Brad flashed in his mind. The way she had laughed at his jokes, the way his hand had lingered on her back. Ethan couldn't stop replaying it over and over again. He'd tried to tell himself he was overreacting, that it was just his insecurity talking. Mia had always been flirty. It was part of her personality. That didn't mean anything was going on, right? She had told him that Brad was just a friend, and he needed to trust her. But something didn't sit right with him. His phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Mia. "Morning, babe. Last night was fun, wasn't it? Just wanted to say I love you. Can't wait to see you tonight." Ethan stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard as he tried to think of a reply. She seemed so casual, so carefree. Like last night had been no big deal, just another party, another round of flirting that meant nothing. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't that simple. He typed out a quick response, "Love you too, see you tonight," and set his phone down, but the unease still gnawed at him. His office door swung open, and Ethan's colleague, Mike, walked in, a broad grin on his face. "Hey man, you got a minute?" Ethan forced a smile, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, sure. What's up?" Mike plopped down in the chair across from him, looking way too energized for a Monday morning. "I was gonna see if you're free for drinks later this week. A couple of us are heading out to celebrate that deal with Connors. Thought you might want to join." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly, barely registering what Mike was saying. "Yeah, sounds good." Mike narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "You all right, man? You seem distracted." Ethan shook his head, trying to brush it off. "Nah, I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Work? Or something else?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before deciding to confide in him, if only to get the weight off his chest. "It's..." Mike's face shifted to one of concern. "Oh yeah? What's going on?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, man. Last night we had some people over. You know, one of her party nights. It was all fine, but there's this guy, Brad." Mike winced immediately at the name. "Brad? Dude, I've heard about him. He's bad news." That wasn't what Ethan wanted to hear. "Yeah, I figured," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "He was all over her last night and she didn't seem to care. She said they're just friends, but something about it feels off." Mike leaned in, his expression serious now. "Listen, man, I'm not trying to freak you out, but I've seen guys like Brad before. He's the type who thinks he can get whatever he wants, especially with married women. If I were you, I'd keep an eye on him." Ethan swallowed hard, the pit in his stomach growing deeper. He didn't want to be the paranoid husband, the guy who freaked out every time his wife talked to another man. But hearing Mike say it, hearing someone else confirm that Brad was trouble, only made the doubts in his mind grow louder. "I don't know what to do," Ethan admitted quietly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I don't want to accuse her of anything without proof, but something doesn't feel right." Mike nodded slowly. "I get it. You don't want to jump to conclusions, but trust your gut, man. If something feels off, there's a reason for it." Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his temples. His gut was telling him something was wrong, but what could he do? If he confronted Mia without any proof, she'd just call him paranoid, and maybe he was. "Thanks, Mike," Ethan said after a moment, offering a weak smile. "I appreciate it." Mike gave him a sympathetic look as he stood up. "Anytime, man. Just keep your eyes open, and don't let that guy get too close." Ethan nodded as Mike left the room, but the unease only grew stronger. He glanced down at his phone, Mia's carefree text still sitting there, and his stomach twisted. Brad had already gotten too close. The thumping bass from the nightclub's speakers reverberated through Ethan's chest, but he barely noticed the music. His eyes were glued to Mia, who was at the center of the dance floor, swaying her hips to the beat as if she owned the place. Neon lights flashed around her, illuminating her perfect figure as she danced with reckless abandon. Ethan sat at the bar, nursing a drink he didn't really want. It was Mia's idea to come out tonight, a spontaneous decision after she had received a text from some friends. It wasn't the kind of place Ethan felt comfortable in, too loud, too chaotic. But Mia had insisted, and he had agreed, as always. What he hadn't agreed to was the way she was acting tonight. Mia was in her element, throwing back drinks, dancing with strangers, and pulling people into her orbit. It wasn't unusual for her to be flirty when she'd had a few drinks, but tonight, it felt different. Her movements were bolder, her laughter louder, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was pushing the boundaries. On purpose. The crowd around her cheered as she twirled, her dress hugging her curves. A few guys, strangers probably, moved closer, clearly enjoying the show. Mia welcomed the attention, her hands grazing their shoulders as she danced. Ethan's jaw tightened. He couldn't help but wonder if this was her way of testing him, seeing how far she could go before he said something. But Ethan wasn't the jealous type, at least he hadn't been before. He took another sip of his drink, trying to play it cool. After all, this was just Mia being Mia, right? She liked attention, liked to have fun, but the nagging doubt in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. The more he watched her, the more it felt like something had changed. And then Brad walked in. Ethan's heart sank the moment he saw him. Brad made his entrance like he owned the place, striding confidently through the crowd with that cocky smirk plastered on his face. He didn't seem to notice Ethan sitting at the bar, or maybe he just didn't care. But his eyes locked on Mia almost immediately. Mia spotted him too, her face lighting up in a way that made Ethan's stomach twist. She smiled and waved him over, and before Ethan could even process what was happening, Brad was right there, slipping seamlessly into her space. Ethan's grip tightened around his glass as he watched the two of them. Brad was saying something to Mia, something that made her throw her head back in laughter. His hand slid around her waist just for a moment, but it was enough to send a surge of anger coursing through Ethan's veins. Was this what she wanted? Was this why she dragged him out here tonight? He couldn't take it anymore. Ethan set his drink down and stood up, making his way through the crowd toward them. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of jealousy, anger, and fear swirling in his gut. As he got closer, Mia noticed him and flashed him a bright smile. "Ethan, come join us," she called, her words slightly slurred from the alcohol. Brad turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked Ethan up and down. "Hey man," he said with that same smug grin. "Didn't see you there." Ethan forced a tight smile, ignoring Brad and focusing on Mia. "You've been having fun, huh?" Mia giggled, clearly tipsy. "Just a little. You should loosen up, babe. Come dance." Brad chuckled, raising an eyebrow at Ethan. "Yeah, man. You should join in. Mia's the life of the party tonight." Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking between them. "I'm fine right here," he said coldly. Brad's smirk widened. "Suit yourself." For a moment, they stood there in awkward silence, the tension between the three of them thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan could feel Brad's eyes on him, mocking him, daring him to say something. But Mia acted like nothing was wrong, like this was just another fun night out. Brad leaned in closer to Mia, his voice low but loud enough for Ethan to hear. "You know, Mia, you really know how to work a crowd. They're eating you up out there." Mia laughed, swaying on her feet. "I'm just having fun." "Yeah, I can see that," Brad said, his hand grazing her arm. "You're a free spirit. I like that." Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "Let's go," he said, his voice tense as he grabbed Mia's arm. Mia looked at him, her smile faltering. "What? Why?" "We're leaving," Ethan said, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Brad. "Now." Mia's expression darkened, and she pulled her arm away from him. "Don't be like that, Ethan. We're just having a good time. You're being paranoid." Brad chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax, man. It's just a party. Ethan's blood boiled. I said we're leaving. Mia crossed her arms, glaring at him. Fine, go ahead. I'm staying. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the anger and humiliation threatening to overwhelm him. Mia had never defied him like this before, not in front of someone like Brad. He felt trapped, powerless, like he was losing control of everything. Brad smirked, watching the whole scene unfold with obvious amusement. Maybe you should loosen up, Ethan, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. You're acting like you're afraid someone's going to steal her. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to punch Brad right there, to wipe that smug grin off his face. But instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Mia and Brad behind. As he pushed his way through the crowd and out into the night, Ethan felt like his world was crumbling. Mia had crossed a line tonight. And Brad? Brad was right there, pushing every button, daring him to react. For the first time, Ethan didn't know if his marriage could survive this. Ethan slammed the front door behind him, his heart still racing from the scene at the nightclub. His head pounded with the rhythm of the music that still echoed in his mind. But it was the memory of Mia and Brad, standing so close, that fueled the rage boiling inside him. He paced the living room, hands running through his hair as he tried to calm himself down. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Mia, sending him some flippant text to smooth things over, like she always did. But Ethan couldn't bring himself to check it. Not now. Minutes passed, and the apartment remained silent. Eventually, the sound of keys jingling in the lock cut through the tension, followed by the click of the door. Mia stepped inside, her heels tapping lightly against the hardwood floor as she made her way into the living room. Ethan, she called out, her voice softer now, less playful than it had been at the club. She spotted him standing near the window, his back to her. Are you seriously mad? He turned around slowly, his jaw clenched. You really don't get it, do you? Mia crossed her arms, rolling her eyes. Oh my God, Ethan. It was a party. People dance, people flirt, it's not a big deal. Not a big deal? Ethan repeated, his voice trembling with anger. You were all over him. Brad was practically drooling over you, and you didn't even care. Mia sighed, shaking her head. You're blowing this way out of proportion. I'm blowing it out of proportion? Ethan's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. You've been pushing boundaries for weeks now, Mia. You're out every night, flirting with guys, acting like I don't even exist half the time. And then there's Brad. He's been hanging around you, acting like he's entitled to you, and you're just letting it happen. Mia's eyes flashed with annoyance. Brad is a friend, Ethan. That's it. You're jealous, and it's making you paranoid. Ethan took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. You think I'm jealous? This isn't about jealousy, Mia. This is about respect. You don't care how it looks, do you? You don't care how I feel? Mia let out a frustrated laugh, throwing her hands in the air. Oh, please, I don't have time for this. I'm not going to stand here and justify my friendships just because you're insecure. Ethan stared at her, the words stinging more than he expected. Insecure. It wasn't the first time Mia had used that word to dismiss his feelings, but this time, it cut deeper. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't even acknowledging what was happening. And what about Brad? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, though still filled with tension. What the hell is going on with him? Mia's expression softened, but only for a moment. Nothing, Ethan. We're just friends. You need to stop looking for problems where there aren't any. Ethan clenched his fists, taking a deep breath to steady himself. I know what I saw, Mia. The way you two looked at each other tonight, the way he touches you, talks to you. It's not innocent, and you're not stopping it. Mia's eyes narrowed, her tone growing colder. So what do you want me to do? Cut off all my friends because you're uncomfortable? Is that it? I want you to be honest with me, Ethan said, his voice cracking. Because right now, I don't even know who you are anymore. Mia's face twisted into an expression of frustration and disappointment. Maybe that's the problem. You don't know me. You never really have. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. Was this it? Was this how it ended? A few words thrown carelessly in anger, a lifetime of love and trust dissolving before his eyes. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Mia glanced at the clock, then back at Ethan, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "I'm tired," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I don't want to fight anymore." Ethan stared at her, wanting to say something, anything that could fix this. But the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, his mind a mess of anger, fear, and confusion. Without another word, Mia turned and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, leaving Ethan alone in the living room. The echo of her footsteps faded into silence, and all that remained was the crushing realization that something was irreparably broken between them. Ethan sank down onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that nothing was going on with Brad, that this was all just some misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew. He knew that things had already gone too far. The problem was, he didn't know how to fix it. Ethan stared blankly at his computer screen, the numbers and charts blurring together as his mind drifted back to Mia. He hadn't been able to concentrate since the argument. Every time he tried to focus, his thoughts snapped back to the club, to the way Brad looked at her, to Mia's cold, dismissive tone when they had argued afterward. The doubt was eating him alive. His phone vibrated on the desk, and for a split second his heart raced. Maybe it was Mia. Maybe she had texted him, wanting to make things right to apologize. But when he glanced down, it was just a work email. He exhaled sharply, feeling a mix of frustration and disappointment wash over him. For the past few days, Mia had acted as though everything was fine, like their argument had never happened. She still smiled, still kissed him goodbye in the mornings, but there was a distance between them now, something unspoken, simmering just beneath the surface. Ethan could feel it. And the worst part? She still hadn't said anything about Brad. That name alone was enough to send Ethan into a spiral of anger and confusion. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Was Mia telling the truth? Was she really just friends with Brad? Or had things already crossed a line? Ethan had no proof, but the way she had dismissed his concerns so easily made him doubt everything. The anxiety gnawed at him, filling his mind with images of Mia and Brad together, laughing behind his back. Unable to take the uncertainty any longer, Ethan did something he never thought he would do. He checked Mia's phone bill. It wasn't difficult. They shared the same account, and it only took a few clicks to see the call logs. At first, he felt guilty, like he was violating her privacy, betraying her trust. But as the list of calls appeared on the screen, his guilt was replaced by something darker. There it was. Brad's number, repeated over and over again, at all hours of the day, late at night, during lunch breaks, and even while Ethan had been at work. There were texts too. So many texts. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he scrolled through the list, his breath quickening with every entry. He felt sick. The doubt that had been gnawing at him turned into a full-blown panic. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. What were they talking about? Why were they texting each other so much? Was she meeting him when she said she was out with friends? Every possibility sent his heart into a downward spiral. His phone buzzed on the desk again. This time, it was a text from Mia. "Grabbing drinks with some friends after work. I'll be home later. Don't wait up." Ethan stared at the message, his stomach twisting into knots. Was she really with friends, or was she with Brad? He couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, Ethan opened his contacts and found the number he had been dreading. The number that was all over Mia's phone bill. Brad's number. His thumb hovered over the call button, his pulse racing. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't even know if Brad would answer. But the need to know, to finally get some kind of answer, was overwhelming. Before he could talk himself out of it, he hit dial. The phone rang once, twice. Then, on the third ring, Brad answered. "Hello?" Ethan's mouth went dry, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't speak. "Ethan?" Brad's voice was calm, smooth, as if he wasn't surprised at all. Is that you? Ethan swallowed hard, his mind spinning. Yeah, it's me. There was a pause, and then Brad chuckled softly. To what do I owe the pleasure, man? Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice steady. I want to know what's going on with you and Mia. Another pause. Then Brad let out a low, mocking laugh. You're really going to ask me that? You think I'm going to tell you? Ethan's hands trembled as he gripped the phone tighter. I'm not playing games, Brad. I deserve to know the truth. Brad's laughter grew louder, crueler. The truth? Come on, Ethan. You already know what's going on, don't you? You wouldn't be calling me if you didn't. Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a void of uncertainty and betrayal. Every word from Brad was like a knife twisting in his gut. Are you sleeping with her? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then Brad spoke again, his tone dripping with amusement. That's a question you'll have to figure out on your own, man. Ethan's breath hitched, his mind reeling. But hey, Brad continued, his voice smooth as ever. Since you called, I've got a suggestion. How about we make things a little more interesting? Ethan blinked, confusion cutting through his panic. What the hell are you talking about? Brad chuckled, the sound low and mocking. A threesome, Ethan. You, me, and Mia. What do you say? Ethan's blood ran cold, his heart slamming against his ribs. He felt dizzy, like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. Brad's words hung in the air, heavy with cruel mockery, as if he was daring Ethan to respond. What? Ethan stammered, his voice shaking. You heard me, Brad said, his tone almost casual. Think about it. It could be fun. Mia's an adventurous woman. I'm sure she'd be up for it. Ethan's mind went blank, his body trembling with a mixture of shock and rage. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The audacity, the arrogance. It was too much. Are you serious? Ethan demanded, his voice cracking. Brad just laughed. I'll leave you to think about it. You know how to reach me when you've made up your mind? The line went dead. Ethan stood there, his phone still clutched in his hand, his mind reeling. Brad's laughter echoed in his ears, his cruel words replaying over and over again. He felt sick to his stomach, the weight of the situation crushing him. He had never felt so powerless, so humiliated. And now, he had no idea what to do. Ethan sat at the edge of the rooftop bar, nursing his drink, the cool evening breeze doing little to calm the storm of emotions brewing inside him. The city sprawled out beneath him, glittering with lights, but all he could think about was the conversation he'd had with Brad earlier that day. His hands were still trembling slightly as he clenched the glass in his hand, trying to keep it together. He didn't even know why he was here. Mia had insisted they meet Brad for drinks, acting like everything was fine. He could have refused, he should have refused, but he needed answers. He couldn't let this go any longer. The door to the rooftop swung open, and Mia stepped out, looking radiant as always in a slinky black dress, her hair falling in perfect waves around her shoulders. She smiled at Ethan as she walked over to him, but her eyes flickered with something else, something darker. Behind her, Brad strolled out casually, his usual smirk plastered across his face. He was dressed in a sleek suit, looking every bit the arrogant, cocky man who had sent Ethan's world spiraling into chaos. He sauntered over to the bar, ordered a drink, and then turned to face Ethan, his eyes glinting with amusement. Glad you made it, man, Brad said smoothly, raising his glass in a mock toast. Ethan's jaw tightened as he forced a tight smile, his eyes darting between Mia and Brad. The tension in the air was suffocating. Brad leaned against the railing, clearly enjoying himself, while Mia sat down beside Ethan, crossing her legs and taking a sip of her drink. So, Brad started, his voice oozing with arrogance. How have you been, Ethan? You look tense. Ethan clenched his fists under the table, trying to control the rage bubbling beneath the surface. He didn't want to give Brad the satisfaction of knowing how much he was getting to him. I'm fine, Ethan muttered through gritted teeth. Brad chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on Mia. I bet you are. Mia shot Brad a glance, half smiling, half warning, but she didn't say anything. She seemed content to let Brad steer the conversation, her body language far too relaxed for Ethan's liking. The pit in his stomach deepened with every passing second. Brad took a sip of his drink, watching Ethan over the rim of his glass with a smug smile. "You know, Ethan, I've been thinking a lot about our little conversation earlier." Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't told Mia about the call, about the twisted proposition Brad had thrown his way, and now Brad was bringing it up in front of her. "What conversation?" Mia asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked between them. Ethan's throat went dry. He wasn't sure how to answer, but before he could say anything, Brad took over. "Don't worry, Mia," Brad said, flashing her a cocky grin. "I was just throwing out some suggestions to Ethan earlier. You know, trying to spice things up a bit." Mia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Suggestions?" Ethan could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He shot Brad a warning look, but Brad just smirked, clearly enjoying every moment of this. "Yeah," Brad continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "I suggested that maybe the three of us should explore some new territory together." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as Mia's eyes widened in surprise. She looked at Brad, then back at Ethan, her lips parting slightly as the full meaning of Brad's words sank in. "A threesome?" Mia asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Brad grinned, leaning in slightly. "Exactly. I thought it could be fun, don't you think?" Ethan's face burned with humiliation, his fists trembling with rage. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, couldn't believe Brad was so brazen, so arrogant to say this in front of Mia. And worse, he couldn't believe Mia wasn't immediately shutting it down. "Mia, this is ridiculous," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Tell him to stop." But Mia didn't answer right away. She stared at Brad, her expression unreadable, her eyes flicking between him and Ethan. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw something flash across her face. Excitement, maybe? Curiosity? He wasn't sure, but it terrified him. "Mia," Ethan repeated, his voice more desperate now. Finally, Mia shook her head, laughing softly. "Brad, you're insane." Brad grinned, clearly unbothered by the dismissal. "Am I? Come on, Mia. We both know you like to push boundaries. You've always been adventurous. Why stop now?" Mia's eyes glittered as she smiled at Brad, and Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. She wasn't angry, she wasn't disgusted, she was intrigued. "Jesus Christ," Ethan muttered under his breath, pushing his chair back as he stood up. "I can't do this." He turned to leave, his heart racing, but Brad's voice stopped him cold. "You scared, Ethan?" Ethan froze, his back to them, his hands trembling at his sides. Brad's voice was low, mocking. "Come on, man. It's just a suggestion. No need to be so uptight." Ethan spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. "Are you sleeping with my wife?" The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation and pain. For a moment, everything went silent. Even Mia looked startled, her expression shifting from amusement to shock. Brad, however, simply smiled, slowly, deliberately. He took a step closer to Ethan, his eyes locked on his, and let out a low, cruel laugh. "You really want to know the answer to that?" Brad asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his entire body trembling with fear and anger. He didn't know if he wanted the answer. He wasn't sure if he could handle it. Brad leaned in, his eyes gleaming with amusement as he looked directly into Ethan's frightened eyes. "I'll tell you this," he whispered, his voice taunting. "You'd be surprised what Mia's into." Ethan's heart raced, his head spinning with the implications of Brad's words. "And hey," Brad added with a smirk, "take your time with the offer. I'll be waiting." With that, Brad stepped back, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. He took a long sip of his drink, his smile as smug as ever. Ethan felt like the ground had just been pulled out from under him. The world around him spun as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Mia stayed silent, watching the exchange with a strange, unreadable expression on her face. The man who had once been Ethan's friend had turned into his tormentor. And now, Ethan was left standing there, broken, humiliated, and completely powerless. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of him. The steam curled upward, but he didn't take a sip. His mind was miles away, replaying the events from the night before over and over again. Brad's smug face, the proposition, Mia's unsettling silence. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Brad's mocking smile, heard the venom in his voice as he all but confirmed what Ethan had feared for weeks. And Mia, Mia, hadn't said a word to defend herself. She hadn't denied anything, hadn't reassured him. She had just laughed. The sound of footsteps pulled Ethan from his thoughts, and he glanced up to see Mia walking into the kitchen. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back, looking like nothing was out of the ordinary, like their entire relationship hadn't been ripped apart the night before. "Morning," she said casually, grabbing a mug from the cupboard and pouring herself some coffee. Ethan didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. How could she act so normal? How could she just pretend like nothing had happened? Mia took a sip of her coffee and leaned against the counter, finally glancing over at Ethan. "You okay?" she asked, her tone light, like she didn't already know the answer. Ethan clenched his jaw, the anger and betrayal he had been holding back bubbling to the surface. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't sit there and pretend like everything was fine. "No," Ethan said, his voice low, trembling with emotion. "I'm not okay." Mia raised an eyebrow, taking another sip of her coffee. "What's the problem now?" Ethan slammed his fist down on the table, the cup of coffee in front of him rattling. "Don't do that. Don't act like you don't know what's wrong." Mia's expression darkened slightly, but she still didn't seem fazed. "What are you talking about, Ethan? You know damn well what I'm talking about," Ethan shot back, his voice shaking. "Last night, what Brad said, what he proposed. And you..." His voice caught in his throat, the pain of the betrayal overwhelming him. "You didn't even deny it. You didn't say anything." Mia sighed, setting her cup down on the counter. "Ethan, you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Ethan's voice rose, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're joking, right? He suggested we have a threesome, Mia. He all but admitted that something's been going on between you two, and you just laughed it off like it was nothing." Mia's face remained cold, her eyes hardening as she crossed her arms. "You need to calm down." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Calm down? You expect me to calm down after what happened last night? You didn't even deny it, Mia. You didn't deny that something's been going on with Brad. What am I supposed to think?" Mia's jaw tightened, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Look, Ethan, you're blowing this way out of proportion. Brad was just messing with you. He likes to get under people's skin. You're letting him get to you." Ethan shook his head, the disbelief crashing over him in waves. "You really think I'm that stupid, don't you? You think I didn't notice the way you two looked at each other? The way he touches you? You think I haven't seen the texts? I'm not blind, Mia." Mia's eyes flickered for a brief moment. Hesitation, guilt, maybe. But she quickly masked it, her expression turning defensive. "So what if we text? He's a friend." Ethan's heart sank. The coldness in her voice, the lack of remorse. It was like she didn't even care. Like he was the one overreacting, the one at fault for questioning her. "Friend?" Ethan scoffed, his voice breaking. "You're not just friends, Mia. Don't lie to me." Mia's eyes narrowed. "And what if we're not just friends? What if there's more? What then, Ethan?" The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His entire body went cold as he stared at her, his mind reeling from the weight of her admission. "Mia." Ethan's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "What have you done?" Mia didn't answer right away. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "Look, I didn't plan for this to happen, but things have been different between us for a long time. You know that." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the betrayal cutting deeper than he ever thought possible. "So you turned to him? To Brad?" Mia didn't meet his eyes. "I didn't turn to him. It just happened. Ethan stood up from the table, his hands shaking with anger and heartbreak. How long? Mia swallowed hard, finally looking up at him. Does it really matter? Yes, it matters, Ethan shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. How long, Mia? She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking away from him. A few months? Ethan felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. A few months. This had been going on for months, right under his nose, and he had been too blind to see it. I don't believe this, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair as he paced the kitchen. I trusted you, Mia. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? Mia crossed her arms again, her voice cold and detached. You think this is all my fault? You think you're blameless in this? You're the one who's been distant, Ethan. You're the one who's been checked out for months. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't feel that? Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your affair? Mia didn't back down. I'm not blaming you, but you're not innocent in this either. Ethan stared at her, his heart breaking as the weight of her words sank in. He had always known things weren't perfect between them, but he never imagined it would come to this. He never imagined Mia would betray him like this. I don't even know who you are anymore, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Mia sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm sorry, Ethan, but I can't change what happened. Ethan looked at her, the woman he had loved for so long, and felt a wave of despair wash over him. The woman he thought he knew was gone, and in her place was a stranger. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost. Ethan watched from across the street, his heart pounding in his chest as Mia and Brad entered the hotel together. It had been a week since the argument in their kitchen, since Mia had admitted that something was going on with Brad, and everything in Ethan's life had spiraled out of control since then. He hadn't confronted her again after that day. He hadn't known what to say, how to process it. She had offered no apology, no attempt to fix things. Instead, she had acted like their conversation had been an inevitable revelation, and now, she had moved on with Brad in plain sight. It was like she didn't care at all. Ethan had tried to hold on to some sliver of hope in the days that followed, hoping that maybe she would realize what she had done, that maybe she would try to make things right. But instead, Mia had grown more distant, spending nights away from home, offering vague excuses whenever he asked where she was going. He had known, deep down, that she was with Brad. But seeing it now, right in front of him, was a gut-wrenching confirmation. The hotel was one of the most luxurious in the city, a place for the wealthy to hide their dirty secrets behind thick walls and golden chandeliers. And Mia, his wife, was walking right into it with another man. Brad's arm was draped casually over her shoulders, his face plastered with that familiar smirk, as if he knew Ethan was watching and enjoyed every second of it. Ethan felt his stomach twist into knots, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to run after them, to confront them right there in the lobby, but his feet were frozen in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The weight of their betrayal was too much. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his daze. He glanced down at the screen. Mia. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Ethan stared at the text, his hand shaking. The blatant lie was almost worse than the affair itself. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, not really. She was just stringing him along, keeping him in the dark while she lived a double life with Brad. His hands balled into fists as he stared at the hotel entrance, his mind racing. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there watching as his marriage fell apart in front of him. But what could he do? What was left to save? Ethan watched as Mia and Brad disappeared into the hotel, their laughter echoing in his ears. The world around him seemed to blur, the lights of the city spinning into a dizzying haze. He felt trapped, suffocating under the weight of his own helplessness. He could see it so clearly now. Brad had won. The man had taken everything from him. And Mia? Mia had chosen Brad, whether she admitted it or not. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and she wasn't looking back. For a moment, Ethan considered walking into the hotel, storming up to their room and forcing a confrontation. But what would that accomplish? Mia had already made her choice, and Brad was just waiting to mock him, to push him further into the abyss. The thought of facing them made Ethan's stomach turn. He couldn't do it. He couldn't handle the humiliation. Not again. Instead, he turned away, his feet dragging as he walked back to his car. The pain of betrayal gnawed at him, eating him alive from the inside out. He had never felt so alone, so powerless. Every step felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, crushing him with the reality that Mia was gone. Gone in every way that mattered. When he finally reached his car, Ethan collapsed into the driver's seat, his head falling into his hands. He wanted to scream, to break something, anything. But all he could do was sit there, numb and broken, staring at the dashboard as the world around him spun out of control. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it wasn't Mia. It was Brad. The text was simple, but it felt like a knife to Ethan's gut. "Having fun tonight. Wish you were here." Ethan's vision blurred as he stared at the message, his hands trembling with rage. He could picture Brad's smug face as he typed those words, knowing exactly how much it would hurt. It was cruel, calculated. A reminder that Brad had taken everything from him, and he enjoyed it. Ethan clenched his phone in his hand, his knuckles turning white as a wave of fury washed over him. He wanted to smash the phone, to throw it out the window, to scream until his throat was raw. But instead, he sat there, paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of it all. Brad wasn't just winning. He was savoring every second of Ethan's destruction, mocking him with every taunt, every laugh. And Mia? Mia was complicit in all of it. She had become a part of Brad's twisted game, and now Ethan was just a spectator in his own life, watching as everything he loved was torn apart. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel. But eventually, the reality of it all hit him like a tidal wave. It was over. Mia was gone. She wasn't coming back. Not to him. And Brad? Brad would never let him forget it. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet when Ethan returned home. He stepped inside, letting the door close softly behind him. The familiar space felt foreign now, cold and empty, as if it no longer belonged to him. The walls, the furniture, even the pictures of him and Mia, they were all reminders of a life that no longer existed. He tossed his keys onto the table, the sound echoing in the silence. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Anger, heartbreak, betrayal. His heart still pounded from what he had seen at the hotel, from Brad's cruel text, from the final, crushing realization that Mia was gone. Ethan walked slowly through the apartment, each step heavier than the last. He passed the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, all the places where they had shared their life together. But those memories felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. He stopped at the bedroom door, pushing it open with a trembling hand. The bed was made neatly, untouched, as if Mia hadn't even slept there in days. He stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the bed, feeling the emptiness closing in around him. Everything had fallen apart. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, snapping him back to reality. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he saw Brad's name on the screen. "You know, Mia's even better than I imagined. Shame you couldn't join us." The rage hit him like a tidal wave, consuming every rational thought in his mind. He threw the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. The pieces scattered on the floor, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Ethan collapsed onto the edge of the bed, his hands shaking as he buried his face in them. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to destroy something, anything. But instead, he sat there, silent, as the weight of it all crushed him. He had lost her, completely. Mia had made her choice. She had chosen Brad, chosen the thrill of betrayal over the life they had built together. And Brad had taken everything from him, laughing the whole time, rubbing it in his face. The rage surged again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just anger, it was something darker, something deeper. The helplessness, the humiliation, the pain, it all swirled together into a storm that Ethan couldn't control. His eyes drifted toward the nightstand. The drawer. He stared at it for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He knew what was inside. His hand moved on its own, slowly reaching for the drawer's handle. His heart raced, his vision blurred with tears, but he couldn't stop himself. He pulled the drawer open, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal inside. The gun. It sat there, gleaming in the dim light of the room, like a final answer to all the questions swirling in his mind. His breath hitched as he picked it up, the weight of it heavy in his hand.